In the Red Hills of New Mexico territory, she lived alone with her ghosts and her shotgun. The townspeople called her strange, touched, but when a fierce storm brought an unexpected visitor to her door, everything changed.
Please.
One word. That's all it took to bring together two outsiders in a world determined to keep them apart.
I've lived in mud before. Doesn't mean I want to leave people there.
What began as shelter from a storm became something neither could have imagined. But when the sheriff and his men came hunting for the Apache warrior, Ruth made a choice that would change her life forever.
You should have left me to them. Why risk everything for me?
Because for the first time in my life, I found someone worth standing up for.
Now with a noose waiting for him and a town turning against her, their forbidden connection will ignite a passion strong enough to defy a territory's hatred. But as soldiers close in and bullets fly, will their love survive the coming storm? Before we begin this Wild West romance, tell us in the comments, have you ever risked everything for love? The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the red hills of New Mexico territory. Most folks with any sense stayed indoors during the worst heat of the day, but Ruth Calder wasn't most folks. She stood outside her small adobe home, wiping sweat from her brow as she finished hanging laundry on the line. Her faded blue dress clung to her slender frame, and wisps of honey-brown hair escaped from her practical bun. At 26, Ruth had already lived a lifetime of hardship. The adobe house she called home was all she had left of her family, a crumbling reminder of a mother who died too young and a father who found more comfort in whiskey than in raising his daughter. "Come on now, Daisy," Ruth called to one of her goats that had wandered too close to the garden patch. "You know better than that." The goat bleated in protest, but moved away from the vegetables Ruth had struggled to grow in the harsh soil. Those vegetables, along with the goat's milk and cheese she sold in town, were how she survived. It wasn't much of a living, but it was hers. As she finished with the laundry, Ruth looked up at the sky. Dark clouds were building in the distance. A summer storm was coming, and from the looks of those clouds, it would be a big one. "Best get you all settled in," she said to her small herd. "Gonna be a rough night." Inside her humble home, Ruth lit a lamp and sat at the rickety table her father had built years ago. She pulled out a piece of paper and began to write another letter she knew would never be sent. "Dear someone, the monsoon season is here again. The air feels heavy with promise. Sometimes I think these storms are the only things that ever change around here. The people in town still whisper when I walk by. Mrs. Peterson asked again why a pretty young thing like me insists on living alone up in these hills. As if being someone's wife is the only worth a woman can have. Maybe I'm waiting for something. Not a husband. God knows I've had enough offers from men who just want my land or someone to cook their meals. I'm waiting for something real in a world full of lies." Ruth stopped writing when she heard the first rumble of thunder. She folded the letter and tucked it into a wooden box with dozens of others. Letters to no one, conversations with herself, dreams written down so she wouldn't forget how to hope. By nightfall, the storm had arrived in full fury. Rain pounded against the roof, finding its way through a few small leaks that Ruth had been meaning to fix. She placed buckets under the drips and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the sudden chill. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it made the walls tremble. Ruth wasn't afraid of storms. In fact, she loved them, the raw power, the cleansing rain. Out here, storms were honest. They didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. She was just about to bank the small fire when she heard it, a pounding at her door that wasn't the wind or fallen debris. Someone was outside in this terrible storm. Ruth grabbed her shotgun. Living alone had taught her caution. "Who's there?" she called out. The only answer was more pounding, more desperate this time. Taking a deep breath, Ruth unlatched the door and pulled it open. The wind nearly tore it from her hands as rain slashed sideways into her home. Standing on her threshold was the tallest man she'd ever seen. His long black hair was plastered to his face, which was streaked with blood from a wound at his temple. His buckskin clothing was soaked through, and he swayed slightly as he stood there. Even in the dim light, Ruth could see he was Apache, one of the warriors the townspeople feared and hated. Their eyes met. His were dark and filled with pain, but there was something else there too, a fierce dignity that caught Ruth by surprise. "Please," was all he said, the word rough and strained. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed forward. Ruth dropped her shotgun and caught him as best she could, his weight nearly bringing her to her knees. With strength born of years of hard work, she managed to drag him inside and close the door against the howling storm. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had an Apache warrior unconscious on her floor. If anyone from town found out, they'd think she was crazier than they already believed. But as Ruth looked at the blood trailing down his face, she didn't see an enemy. She saw a man in need. "Well," she said to herself, "ain't like I got anywhere to take you in this storm." Ruth worked quickly, stoking the fire to bring warmth back to the room. She fetched clean rags and her small supply of medicines, then knelt beside the unconscious man. Gently, she cleaned the wound on his temple. It was deep, but not as bad as the blood had made it seem. As she worked, she couldn't help but study his face. Strong features, high cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. There were scars on his hands and arms that spoke of a hard life. "Who are you?" she whispered, though she expected no answer. "And what were you doing out in a storm like this?" She managed to get a blanket under him and another over him. He was too heavy for her to move to her bed, so she made him as comfortable as she could by the fire. The wound had stopped bleeding, but he still hadn't woken. Ruth stayed up most of the night, checking on him and adding wood to the fire. It had been a long time since she'd had another person in her home. The last had been Sheriff Miles, who occasionally rode up to check on her, though Ruth suspected his visits had more to do with his interest in her land than concern for her welfare. By morning, the storm had settled into a steady downpour that showed no signs of letting up. The trails would be washed out, meaning no one from town would be coming up the hill anytime soon. Ruth was checking on her patient when his eyes suddenly opened. She jumped back, startled, as he tried to sit up. Pain flashed across his face, and he raised a hand to the bandage on his head. "Easy now," Ruth said, keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. "That's a nasty wound you've got." The man looked around, taking in his surroundings before his gaze settled on her. He seemed wary but not threatening. "You helped me," he said. His voice was deep, his English accented but clear. Ruth nodded. "Found you at my door, half dead in the storm." He studied her face. "You should have left me in the mud." "I've lived in mud before," she answered without thinking. "Doesn't mean I want to leave people there." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps or curiosity. "My name is Chogan," he said after a moment. "Ruth Calder." "I will not harm you, Ruth Calder." She almost smiled at that. "Figured if you wanted to hurt me, you'd have done it already instead of saying please and passing out on my floor." Chogan attempted to stand, but swayed dangerously. Ruth rushed forward to steady him. "You ain't going nowhere in this weather, and you ain't in any shape to try. Best you rest until the storm passes." To her surprise, he didn't argue. He sank back down, his face pale beneath its natural bronze tone. "I have water," Ruth said, "and some stew from yesterday. You should eat something." While he ate, Ruth checked on her goats in the small lean-to attached to her house. They were dry and content, untroubled by the storm or the stranger in their owner's home. When she returned, Chogan had finished the stew. He watched her with those intense dark eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Why do you live alone?" he asked suddenly. Ruth hesitated. People in town asked her that question all the time, but coming from him, it didn't sound like judgment. "This is my home," she said simply. "Been my home all my life. My pa built it for my ma when they first married. After they both passed, there was nowhere else for me to go, nowhere else I wanted to go." "The townspeople? They allow this?" Ruth laughed, a short, sharp sound. "They don't have much say in it. They think I'm strange, touched in the head maybe, too proud to find myself a husband." She shrugged. "Let them talk. Words don't bother me none." "Words can cut deeper than knives," Chogan said quietly. Ruth looked at him, really looked at him. "Reckon you'd know something about that." Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, an unlikely trust began to form between two souls accustomed to standing alone against the world. As the day wore on, Ruth went about her chores while Chogan rested. Occasionally, she would catch him watching her, his expression thoughtful. "You were part of a war party," she said finally, Not a question, but a statement. Chogan nodded. We were returning from a raid. There was a fight. My horse was shot from under me. I became separated from the others. And you ended up at my door. The storm confused me. I saw your light. Ruth thought about what the people in town would say if they knew she was harboring an Apache warrior. Sheriff Miles would probably have her committed. Or worse, he'd hang Chogan without asking questions. You picked a dangerous place to seek shelter, she said. Most folks around here shoot first when it comes to Apache. And you? Chogan asked. Why didn't you shoot? Ruth considered his question. Guess I've never been much for shooting someone who's asking for help, Apache or not. That night, as the storm raged on with no signs of letting up, Ruth made a simple supper of cornbread and beans. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Tell me about your people, Ruth said as she cleared away their plates. Chogan was quiet for so long that Ruth thought he wouldn't answer, but then he began to speak, his voice low and musical, about his tribe, about the mountains where they made their home, about traditions passed down through generations. Ruth listened, entranced. The world he described was so different from her own, yet she understood the love of land, of home, of belonging somewhere. When he finished, she found herself sharing stories of her own childhood, of her mother teaching her to make soap, of her father before the drink took him, of the dreams she'd once had of seeing places beyond these red hills. You could still go, Chogan said. Ruth shook her head. No, this is where I belong. It ain't much, but it's mine. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, though water still rushed down the hillside in muddy torrents. Tomorrow, Ruth knew, the trails might be passable again. Tomorrow, the real world would intrude on this strange peace they'd found. But for now, in the warm glow of the fire, time seemed suspended. Two lonely souls finding unexpected comfort in each other's company. As Ruth prepared her bed for the night, offering Chogan blankets by the fire, she realized something that should have frightened her but didn't. She didn't want tomorrow to come. For the first time in years, her house felt like a home again. Thank you, Chogan said as she bid him good night, for your kindness. Ruth nodded, unsure how to respond to the sincerity in his voice. She wasn't used to gratitude. Get some rest, she said. That head of yours needs healing. In the night, Ruth woke to the sound of Chogan moving restlessly, caught in the grip of what seemed to be a nightmare. Without thinking, she went to him, kneeling beside his makeshift bed. Shh, she soothed, the way her mother used to comfort her after bad dreams. You're safe here. Chogan's eyes flew open, wild and disoriented. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist. For a moment, fear flickered through Ruth, not of him, but of the demons that clearly haunted him. Then recognition dawned in his eyes and he released her. I'm sorry, he whispered. It's all right, Ruth said. We all got ghosts that visit in the night. Their eyes held in the dim light of the dying fire. Something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that transcended words. Ruth returned to her bed, but sleep was long in coming. She lay awake, listening to the rain and thinking about the man sleeping just a few feet away. A man who should have been her enemy, but somehow felt more like a kindred spirit. Dawn broke with unexpected clarity. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a washed-clean sky and muddy trails that steamed in the morning sun. Ruth stepped outside to check the damage. The goats bleated for their breakfast, unimpressed by the night's drama. Everything looked the same, yet Ruth felt different, as if the storm had changed something inside her as well as the landscape. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Chogan come up behind her until he spoke. Your home is still standing. Ruth turned, surprised to see him up and moving so well. Takes more than a storm to bring down these old walls. Chogan looked out at the red hills, now vibrant with morning light. I should go. It isn't safe for you if I stay. Before Ruth could answer, a sound split the air, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoing across the canyon. Ruth froze, her eyes meeting Chogan's. That shot wasn't meant for game, it was a signal. In the distance she could see them, a group of riders making their way up the muddy trail toward her home. Even from here, she recognized Sheriff Miles at the lead. They're coming for you, she said, her voice tight. Chogan's face hardened. Then I must leave. Now? No. Ruth surprised herself with the forcefulness of her response. There's nowhere to run, not with those men coming up the only trail. She made a decision then, one that defied everything she'd been taught about self-preservation. She'd spent her whole life keeping to herself, avoiding trouble, but standing there looking at Chogan, she knew she couldn't turn him over to men who would hang him without a second thought. "Stay behind me," she said, walking back into the house. She emerged moments later with her shotgun. "Ruth," Chogan began, but she cut him off. "My house, my rules." She positioned herself on the porch, shotgun ready but not raised as the riders approached. The rising sun glinted off Sheriff Miles's badge as he reined in his horse at the foot of her porch. 5 men flanked him, all armed, all wearing expressions that ranged from suspicion to outright hostility. "Morning, Ruth," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. His eyes slid past her to where Chogan stood. "I see you've got company." "What brings you up my hill, Sheriff?" Ruth asked, ignoring his observation. "Got reports of Apache in the area. War party hit the Simmons place 2 days back. Stole cattle. Burned a barn." Miles's hand rested casually on his holstered pistol. "Then we got word that one of them might be hiding out in these parts." "That right?" Ruth kept her voice neutral. "Way I see it," Miles continued, "you're either harboring him against your will, in which case you step aside and let us handle it, or you're helping him, which would make you as guilty as he is." Ruth felt Chogan tense behind her. She didn't look back, keeping her eyes fixed on the sheriff. "Ain't neither of those things, Miles," she said calmly. "This man came to my door hurt and half drowned in the storm. I helped him same as I'd help any creature in need." One of the men spat on the ground. "That ain't no man, Ruth. That's a savage." Ruth's fingers tightened on her shotgun. "The next man who calls him savage in front of me better be ready to bleed." The riders shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. They hadn't expected resistance, especially not from a woman they'd always seen as odd, but harmless. Sheriff Miles dismounted, his boots squelching in the mud. "Be reasonable, Ruth. He's wanted for theft and murder. We're taking him in one way or another." Ruth raised her shotgun then, not pointing it directly at the sheriff, but making her intention clear. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the nervous shifting of horses and the distant calling of a hawk. Then Chogan stepped forward, placing himself beside Ruth instead of behind her. He stood tall, his presence somehow filling the space around them. He said nothing, but his stance spoke volumes. He would not run, would not hide behind a woman's skirts. Something changed in the air then. The men saw not just a lone woman defying them, but a woman standing side by side with a warrior, neither backing down. Sheriff Miles's eyes narrowed as he looked between them. Whatever he saw made him pause. "You know what folks in town will say about this, Ruth," he said, his voice low. "Defending an Indian over your own kind." Ruth's laugh was harsh. "My own kind? When has anyone in that town ever claimed me as their own? They've called me crazy, called me ghost-touched, left me to fend for myself all these years, and now you ride up here talking about my own kind." Her words hung in the air, sharp with years of loneliness and resentment. "This man has a name," she continued. "It's Chogan, and he's done nothing to harm me or mine. So unless you've got proof he was at the Simmons place, not just that he's Apache, but that he himself did those things, you got no cause to take him." Sheriff Miles hesitated. The law was on his side. But Ruth's fury and determination gave him pause. She'd always been quiet, keeping to herself. This fierce woman with fire in her eyes was someone new, someone unpredictable. And there was something else. Something in the way she stood next to the Apache, something in the look that passed between them. Miles had been a lawman long enough to recognize the lengths people would go to for those they cared about. "This ain't over, Ruth," he said finally, stepping back toward his horse. "You're making a mistake." "Wouldn't be the first time folks thought that about me," she replied steadily. "But this time I know I'm right." The sheriff mounted up, signaling to his men. "We'll be back," he warned, "and next time it won't be just us." Ruth didn't lower her shotgun until the riders had disappeared down the trail. Only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding, her hands beginning to shake with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. Chogan turned to her, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't name. "Why did you do that?" he asked softly. Ruth looked up at him, at this man she barely knew yet had just risked everything for. The answer came from somewhere deep inside her, a truth she hadn't known until she spoke it. "Because for the first time in my life," she said, "I found someone worth standing up for." The sun climbed higher in the sky, drying the mud left by the storm, bringing warmth back to the red hills of New Mexico. But the real warmth, Ruth realized, was right here, in the connection between two souls who had found each other against all odds. Chogan reached out slowly, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face with unexpected gentleness. "They will come back," he said. "I know," Ruth replied, "but we'll be ready." And in that moment, with the morning light turning the world to gold around them, we seemed like the most beautiful word Ruth had ever spoken. The days following Sheriff Miles's visit passed in an uneasy quiet. Ruth went about her chores, tending her goats, working in her small garden, mending clothes, all the while waiting for the sound of horses on the trail. Chogan's wound was healing well, the gash on his temple now a thin red line that would soon be just another scar. They fell into an easy rhythm together. Chogan helped where he could, his strength making short work of tasks that had always taken Ruth twice as long. He repaired her leaking roof, split firewood, and even fashioned better pens for her goats using branches and mud. "You don't have to earn your keep," Ruth told him as she watched him work. Chogan paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Where I come from, everyone contributes." "And where exactly is that?" Ruth asked. She'd been curious about his home, his people, but hadn't wanted to pry. Chogan looked toward the distant mountains, a shadow crossing his face. "North of here, in the high country. My band moves with the seasons. You miss it." It wasn't a question. "It is where I belong," he said simply. Then he looked at her, his dark eyes softening. "But it has never been warm, not like this." Ruth felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wasn't used to such directness, especially from a man. The few suitors she'd had over the years had either treated her like a child to be coaxed or a prize to be won. Chogan spoke to her as an equal, and it both unsettled and thrilled her. "Well," she said, turning away to hide her blush, "warm or not, you can't stay here forever. Sheriff Miles won't let this go." "No," Chogan agreed, "he will not." That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal, Ruth found herself studying Chogan's face in the flickering light. There was a quietness to him that she'd never found in anyone else, not a shyness or reluctance to speak, but a comfort with silence that matched her own. "Tell me about your raid," she said suddenly. "The one that brought you here." Chogan set down his plate, his expression guarded. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I stood up for you. Because I put myself between you and those men." Ruth held his gaze. "I believe you're a good man, Chogan, but I need to know what happened." For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep within him. "We took cattle," he admitted, "but we did not burn buildings or kill anyone. We needed food for our people. The white settlers have taken our hunting grounds, driven away the game. And the Simmons place," Sheriff Miles said. "We were nowhere near there," Chogan interrupted. "Our raid was at the McAllister Ranch, 15 miles west. If someone attacked the Simmons farm, it was not my people." Ruth believed him. Something in his steady gaze, the calm certainty of his words, convinced her he was telling the truth. "Sheriff Miles doesn't care if you did it or not," she said softly. "He just wants someone to blame. It has always been so between my people and yours." There was no bitterness in Chogan's voice, only a weary acceptance. "They're not my people," Ruth said fiercely. "Never have been." Chogan reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers in a touch so light she might have imagined it. "Perhaps that is why you can see me clearly. We are both outsiders." That night, Ruth lay awake long after Chogan had fallen asleep by the fire. His words echoed in her mind. Outsiders. Yes, they were that. She by choice and circumstance, he by birth. But for the first time in years, Ruth didn't feel quite so alone. Morning dawned clear and bright. Ruth was feeding her goats when she noticed a plume of dust on the trail from town. "Chogan," she called, her heart racing. "Someone's coming." He was beside her in an instant, tall and alert. But as the rider drew closer, Ruth relaxed slightly. "It's just Eliza Harper," she said. "She runs the general store in town." Eliza was a widow in her 40s who had always been kinder to Ruth than most. Still, Ruth wasn't taking any chances. She fetched her shotgun and waited on the porch as Eliza's wagon climbed the last stretch of hill. "Morning, Ruth," Eliza called, reining in her mule. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Chogan, but she gave no other sign of surprise. "Thought I'd bring your supplies early this month." Ruth normally went to town once a month to trade cheese and goat's milk for supplies she couldn't produce herself. That Eliza had come to her was unusual. "That's mighty thoughtful," Ruth said cautiously. "Any particular reason?" Eliza climbed down from her wagon with a sigh. "Can we talk inside?" Ruth hesitated, then nodded. "Chogan, would you mind checking on the new goat pen? Make sure it's holding up." He understood what she was really asking, to give them privacy and to stay out of sight. With a slight nod, he moved away toward the back of the property. Inside, Eliza set a bag of supplies on the table. "Sheriff Miles has been talking all over town," she said without preamble, "saying you've taken up with an Apache, that you threatened him and his men." Ruth's jaw tightened. "Is that right?" "He's stirring folks up, Ruth. Some of the men are talking about forming a proper posse coming up here to take your friend. His name is Chogan," Ruth said, "and he hasn't done anything wrong." Eliza gave her a long look. "Doesn't matter much, does it? Not to them. An Apache is an Apache as far as they're concerned." She paused. "And a woman living alone with an Indian man. Well, they're saying all sorts of things about that too." Ruth felt her face grow hot with anger. "Let them talk. I've never cared what they thought before." "This is different, Ruth." Eliza's voice was gentle but firm. "Miles is saying you've turned against your own kind, that you're harboring a murderer. That's a lie." "Maybe so, but it's a lie people are ready to believe." Eliza sighed. "I'm just warning you. Be careful." After Eliza left, Ruth found Chogan by the goat pen, his face grave. "You heard?" she asked. He nodded. "I should go tonight. And go where? They'll be watching the trails. I know ways through the hills that your sheriff and his men would never find." Ruth felt a sudden tightness in her chest at the thought of him leaving. "And what happens when you're gone? You think they'll just leave me be?" "You will be safer without me here." "Will I?" Ruth challenged. "Or will Sheriff Miles just find some other reason to come after me? Maybe decide my land would be better in someone else's hands?" Chogan frowned. "What do you mean?" "What do—" Ruth hadn't meant to say so much, but now that she'd started, the words tumbled out. "Miles has been sniffing around my property for years. He married the banker's daughter a while back, and suddenly he's interested in expanding his holdings. This place sits on good water, one of the few reliable springs in the area. He wants your land," Chogan said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "He's offered to buy it 3 times, each time for less than it's worth." Ruth shook her head. "I've always said no, so maybe he figures if he can't buy it, he'll find another way to take it." Chogan was quiet for a moment, considering. "Then we need a plan, not just for me to escape, but for you to be safe after I'm gone." The way he said "we" sent a warm feeling through Ruth's body. She wasn't used to having someone to share her burdens. "I've been taking care of myself a long time," she said, though without much conviction. Chogan smiled slightly. "Yes, but even the strongest warriors sometimes fight alongside others." That afternoon, they worked together to prepare for whatever might come. Ruth showed Chogan a small cave in the hillside behind her house, a place she'd played as a child and had kept secret all these years. "If they come in force, you can hide here," she explained as they cleared the entrance. Chogan examined the cave with approval. "It would be difficult to find if you didn't know it was here." They stored some food, water, and blankets inside, along with a knife and a small pistol that had belonged to Ruth's father. As the sun began to set, they returned to the house. The air between them seemed charged with something new, a shared purpose, a connection that deepened with each passing hour. Ruth prepared a simple supper, though her mind was too full of worries to think much about food. They ate mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. "Ruth," Chogan said finally, setting down his plate, "why did you never marry?" "The truth." The question caught her off guard. She looked up to find his eyes on her, intent and curious. "Never met a man who didn't want to change me," she said after a moment. They all had ideas about what a wife should be, how she should act. None of those ideas included me being me. "And what is you?" Chogan asked. Ruth struggled to find the words. "Independent, I guess. Strong-willed, my pa used to say. Stubborn, according to most folks in town." She smiled faintly. "I don't need someone to take care of me. I need—" She trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. "What do you need?" Ruth called her. Chogan's voice was soft, almost a whisper. She met his gaze. "Someone who sees me, really sees me, not what they want me to be." Chogan nodded slowly. "In my culture, we believe every person has a spirit path. Some walk this path alone. Others find companions for the journey, but the path itself is sacred." "And your path?" Ruth asked. "Has there been anyone walking it with you?" A shadow crossed his face. "There was a woman, Nahimana. We were to be married." Ruth felt an unexpected pang of jealousy. "What happened?" "Soldiers came to our winter camp." Chogan's voice was flat, but Ruth could hear the pain beneath it. "Many were killed, Nahimana among them." "I'm sorry," Ruth said softly. "It was 3 winters ago." Chogan looked into the fire. "I thought my heart died with her. But now—" He looked up, his eyes meeting Ruth's. "Now I am not so sure." The air between them seemed to still. Ruth's heart beat faster as Chogan rose from his place and moved to sit beside her. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, he reached for her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin. Ruth couldn't remember the last time someone had touched her with such gentleness. "I see you," Ruth called her, he said quietly. "I see your strength, your kindness, your fierce heart." Ruth found herself leaning toward him, drawn by something more powerful than fear or caution. Their foreheads touched, and she closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, pine and earth and open sky. The moment was broken by the distant sound of a horse's whinny. They pulled apart, instantly alert. Chogan was on his feet in one fluid motion, moving to the window. "Riders," he said tersely. "Many of them." Ruth grabbed her shotgun and joined him at the window. In the gathering dusk, she could make out a line of men on horseback coming up the trail. At least a dozen, maybe more. "Hey, it's Miles," she said, recognizing the sheriff at the head of the group. "And looks like half the men in town with him." Chogan's face hardened. "Go to the cave. I will lead them away from here." "No," Ruth grabbed his arm. "That's exactly what they want. To catch you alone so they can hang you without witnesses." "Then what do you suggest?" "I cannot stay here. They will search the house." Ruth thought quickly. "The root cellar, under the kitchen floor. It's small, but it might be enough." Without waiting for his answer, she hurried to the kitchen and moved the small rug aside, revealing a trap door. She pulled it open, revealing a cramped space dug into the earth, where she stored potatoes and other vegetables through the winter. "It's not much," she said apologetically. Chogan was already lowering himself into the space. "It will do." Before he disappeared below, he caught Ruth's hand. "Be careful," he said, his eyes intense. "These men are angry and afraid. A dangerous combination." Ruth nodded, her throat tight. "I'll get rid of them." She closed the trapdoor and replaced the rug just as the sound of hooves reached her yard. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto her porch, shotgun in hand. Sheriff Miles dismounted, his face grim in the fading light. Behind him, the other men remained on their horses, some holding torches that cast an eerie glow over the scene. "Evening, Ruth," Miles said, his tone falsely pleasant. "Hope we're not disturbing your supper." "What do you want, Miles?" Ruth kept her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Same thing as before, the Apache." Miles took a step forward. "We know he's still here, Ruth. No need to protect him anymore." "There's no one here but me," Ruth said. "You can see for yourself." Miles smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, we intend to." He turned to the men behind him. "Jenkins, Carter, check the outbuildings. Thomas, you and Wilson take the back of the house. The rest of you spread out and make sure he doesn't slip away." Ruth's grip tightened on her shotgun. "You have no right to come onto my property like this." "Actually, I do." Miles pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Got a warrant right here, signed by Judge Parker himself, for the arrest of an Apache warrior suspected of murder and cattle theft." He tucked the paper away. "Now, you can make this easy, or you can make it hard, but either way, we're taking him in." Ruth blocked the doorway. "I told you, there's no one here." Miles sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Step aside, Ruth. Don't make me move you." She raised her shotgun. "You take one more step and I'll—" "You'll what?" Miles cut her off. "Shoot me? A lawman doing his duty? That'd get you a hangman's noose right alongside your Apache friend." Ruth hesitated. She knew he was right. If she fired on the sheriff, even to protect her home, she'd be signing her own death warrant. "Ruth," Miles said, his voice suddenly softer, almost kind. "I've known you since you were a girl. Your pa and I used to go hunting together, remember? I don't want to see you hurt." "Then leave," Ruth said, her voice breaking slightly. "Just go away and leave us be." Miles's expression hardened at the word us. "So he is here." Before Ruth could recover, from her slip, 2 men emerged from behind the house. "Found tracks, Sheriff," one called, "fresh ones leading to and from the house." Miles turned back to Ruth, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Move aside, now." Ruth knew she was out of options. If she continued to resist, they'd simply overpower her, and if they found Chogan in her root cellar, they'd hang him on the spot. Slowly, she lowered her shotgun. "Fine, search the house, but I'm coming with you." Miles nodded, gesturing for 2 men to follow him. As they entered the small adobe, Ruth's mind raced. The root cellar was well hidden, but if they searched thoroughly enough, they'd find it. The men began a methodical search, opening cupboards, looking under the bed, checking any space large enough to hide a man. Ruth stood in the kitchen, trying not to look at the rug covering the trapdoor. "What's through here?" Miles asked, pointing to the small pantry off the kitchen. "Just food storage," Ruth said, following him. "Shelves of preserves and such." While they were in the pantry, one of the other men called out from the main room, "Sheriff, found something." Ruth's heart sank as she hurried back, Miles right behind her. The man was holding up a buckskin shirt, Chogan's, which he'd taken off while helping Ruth with chores. Miles took the shirt, examining it with a grim smile. "Apache make, no doubt about it." He turned to Ruth. "Want to change your story now?" Ruth's mind worked frantically. "It's old," she said. "Been here for years. My pa traded with some Apache back before the troubles started." "That right?" Miles didn't sound convinced. He sniffed the shirt. "Smells pretty fresh to me." One of the men stomped across the kitchen floor, pausing as he reached the rug. "Floor sounds different here," he said, kicking at it. Ruth's blood ran cold. "It's just uneven," she said quickly. "Old house, you know how it is." But the man was already moving the rug aside, revealing the trapdoor. "Well, what have we here?" Miles smiled, a predator who'd cornered his prey. "Open it," he ordered. The man pulled up the trapdoor. Ruth held her breath, certain Chogan would be discovered. But to her astonishment, the root cellar was empty. "Nothing but vegetables, Sheriff," the man reported, clearly disappointed. Ruth fought to keep the relief from showing on her face. Somehow Chogan had escaped, but where had he gone? Miles frowned, looking around the small house with suspicion. "He's here somewhere," he muttered. "I can feel it." The search continued for another hour, growing increasingly destructive as the men's frustration mounted. They tore through Ruth's few possessions, broke open her mother's old trunk, even ripped up floorboards in places. By the time they finished, Ruth's home looked as if a tornado had swept through it, but they'd found no sign of Chogan. "He's got to be close by," one of the men insisted. "Maybe in the hills behind the house." "We'll set up a watch," Miles decided. "Carter, You and Wilson take the first shift. The rest of us will be back at first light. He turned to Ruth, his expression cold. Don't try to warn him or help him escape. That'd make you an accessory, and I'd have to arrest you too. Ruth said nothing, her face impassive despite the rage boiling inside her. Only when the men had left, leaving just two behind to keep watch from a distance, did she allow herself to shake with anger and relief. Where had Chogan gone? Had he somehow slipped out of the root cellar and escaped while the men were searching elsewhere? Or had he never been in the cellar at all? As darkness fell completely, Ruth lit a single lamp and began to clean up the mess the searchers had left behind. She worked mechanically, her mind elsewhere, wondering if she would ever see Chogan again. She was so lost in thought that she nearly screamed when a hand touched her shoulder. Whirling around, she found herself face to face with Chogan, who had somehow appeared silently behind her. "How?" she began, but he pressed a finger to his lips, then pointed outside where the two men kept watch. Ruth nodded in understanding. In a whisper so low it was barely audible, she asked, "Where were you? They searched everywhere." Chogan smiled slightly. "Not everywhere." He pointed upward. Ruth looked up at the vigas, the wooden beams that supported her roof. They created a small space between the top of the walls and the roof itself, and a space that would be nearly invisible in the dim light of the house. "You were up there the whole time?" she whispered, amazed. Chogan nodded. "I heard them coming. There was no time to reach the cave." Ruth felt a rush of admiration for his quick thinking and skill. Any other man might have been caught, but Chogan had outmaneuvered Miles and his entire posse. "They're watching the house," she said. "Two men, probably all night." "I saw them." Chogan's face was grim. "Miles will be back at dawn with more men. I must leave tonight." Ruth knew he was right, but the thought of him going filled her with a hollow feeling. "Where will you go?" "Back to my people in the mountains." He looked at her intently. "But first, I need to know you will be safe." "I'll be fine," Ruth said automatically, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Miles was angry, and he wouldn't forget that she had defied him. Chogan took her hands in his. "Come with me." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and tempting all at once. "What?" Ruth wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly. "Come with me," Chogan repeated, his eyes never leaving hers. "To my people. Away from here." Ruth's mind reeled. Leave her home, the only place she'd ever known, to go with a man she'd met just days ago, to live among his people. "I can't," she said, though something in her heart cried out against the words. "This is my home. Everything I have is here." "What do you have?" Chogan asked gently. "A house that is falling apart? Neighbors who despise you? A sheriff who wants your land?" Ruth flinched at the blunt assessment, but she couldn't deny its truth. "My people would welcome you," Chogan continued. "You are strong, skilled with your hands. You know how to survive." He paused. "And you would not be alone anymore." The promise in those last words made Ruth's heart ache. To not be alone, to have someone by her side, to belong somewhere, with someone. "I need time," she said finally, "to think." Chogan nodded. "We have until dawn." They spent the next few hours in whispered conversation, making plans. If Ruth decided to stay, Chogan would leave alone, using a hidden path through the hills that would keep him safely away from the watchers. If she chose to go with him, they would need to gather only the most essential supplies: food, water, warm clothing. "What about my goats?" Ruth asked, suddenly remembering her small herd. "We cannot take them," Chogan said regretfully. "But we could release them. They would likely find their way to other farms." As the night deepened, Ruth found herself torn between the security of the familiar and the promise of something new. Her home had been her sanctuary for so long, but it was also her prison in many ways. The thought of leaving terrified her. The thought of staying, of watching Chogan walk away and never return, terrified her more. "Tell me about your home," she said, "in the mountains." Chogan's face softened as he described the high country, the pine forests, the clear streams, the valleys where his people made their camps. He spoke of mountain meadows filled with wildflowers in the spring, of the way the stars seemed close enough to touch on clear winter nights. "It is a hard life," he admitted. Always moving, always watching for danger, but it is also beautiful. Free. Free. The word resonated within Ruth. Had she ever been truly free? Or had she just exchanged one kind of confinement for another? As dawn approached, the first pale light beginning to creep into the eastern sky, Ruth made her decision. "I'll go with you," she said, the words both frightening and liberating. "But I need to leave something behind, a message." While Chogan gathered the supplies they would need, Ruth sat at her table and wrote a letter, not to no one this time, but to Eliza Harper, the only person in town who had shown her real kindness. "Dear Eliza, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I've left with Chogan of my own free will. Please don't worry about me. For the first time in my life, I'm going towards something instead of just running away. I've left the goats loose. Please take them if you can, or find them good homes. The house and land I leave to you. It's not much, but it's all I have to give in return for your friendship over the years. Maybe you can make something of it that I never could. Tell Sheriff Miles he can stop looking for us. Where we're going, he won't find us. Thank you for everything." Ruth, she folded the letter and placed it on the table where it would be easily found. Then she took one last look around the adobe house that had been her home for all her 26 years. Strange how small it suddenly seemed, how confining. "Are you ready?" Chogan asked, standing in the doorway with their small bundle of supplies. Ruth nodded, a lump in her throat. "As ready as I'll ever be." They slipped out the back of the house while the night still provided some cover. Ruth released her goats from their pen, whispering goodbye to each one. Then, with Chogan leading the way, they made their way into the hills behind the house, following a narrow path that was almost invisible in the pre-dawn light. As the sun began to rise, painting the red hills with golden light, Ruth paused to look back. From this vantage point, she could see her small adobe house, the goat pen, the garden she had tended so carefully, everything that had defined her life until now. Chogan stood beside her, patient, understanding her need for this moment. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "It is not too late to turn back." Ruth looked at him, at this man who had stumbled into her life during a storm and changed everything, who saw her, truly saw her perhaps for the first time. "I'm certain," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. "My home isn't a place, it's wherever the fire is kept lit." Chogan smiled, a rare and beautiful sight that made Ruth's heart skip. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in soft hide. "For you," he said, placing it in her palm. Ruth unwrapped it to find a piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a small mountain. It gleamed in the morning light, blue as the sky. "It is a symbol of protection," Chogan explained, "a sheltering mountain that keeps you safe." Ruth closed her fingers around the stone, feeling its smooth coolness against her skin. "Thank you," she whispered. Behind them, in the distance, they heard shouts. Sheriff Miles and his men had returned, discovering her empty house. "We must go," Chogan said urgently. Hand in hand, they turned away from Ruth's past and moved deeper into the hills, toward a future neither of them could have imagined just days before. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the night's shadows. And somewhere in the red hills of New Mexico, two outsiders found their way together, following a path that was theirs alone. The high country was unlike anything Ruth had ever known. After 3 days of hard travel through rugged terrain, the red hills of her past had given way to pine forests and rocky slopes that seemed to touch the sky. The air was thinner here, crisp with the scent of evergreens and wild sage. Chogan moved through the landscape with the ease of someone returning home, finding paths where Ruth saw only wilderness, spotting water sources hidden among rocks. She followed him, her legs aching from the unaccustomed climbing, but her spirit lighter with each mile that separated her from her old life. "How much farther?" she asked, as they paused to rest beside a clear mountain stream. The cold water soothed her blistered feet as she dangled them in the rushing current. 2 days, maybe 3, Chogan replied, scanning the horizon. "My people will be in the summer camp by now in the high meadow." Ruth nodded, trying not to show her exhaustion. She was used to hard work, but this journey tested her in new ways. Her once sturdy boots were wearing thin, and her dress, practical enough for life on her small homestead, caught on branches and thorns as they traveled. Chogan seemed to read her thoughts. "You are strong," he said simply. "Stronger than you know." His faith in her gave Ruth courage. She pulled her feet from the stream and began to dry them. "I'll be fine, just need to catch my breath." As they traveled, Chogan taught her the ways of the wilderness. He showed her which plants were safe to eat, how to move quietly through the forest, how to read the subtle signs of animals and weather. Ruth proved a quick study, her natural resourcefulness serving her well in this new environment. At night they made small, smokeless fires and slept beneath the stars. Chogan fashioned a simple shelter of branches and hides to protect them from the occasional mountain rain. It was in these quiet evening hours that they truly came to know each other. "Tell me about your mother," Chogan asked one night as they sat by the glowing embers of their fire. "You speak of your father sometimes, but never her." Ruth's hand went instinctively to the turquoise pendant Chogan had given her, which now hung around her neck on a leather cord. "She was beautiful," she said softly, "not in the way town folks think of beauty. She was strong, capable, could shoot straighter than any man my pa knew." "Like her daughter," Chogan observed with a small smile. Ruth returned the smile. "Maybe. She taught me everything, how to keep house, tend animals, grow food in soil that didn't want to give anything up." Her expression grew somber. "She got sick when I was 14, wasted away so fast. Pa was never the same after." "That is when he turned to the whiskey?" Ruth nodded. "He'd drink before, but after Ma died, it was like he was trying to drown himself from the inside out." She looked into the fire. "I tried to help him, but he didn't want help, just wanted to forget." Chogan moved closer, his shoulder touching hers in silent comfort. "My father was a great warrior," he said after a moment. "He died in battle against the Bluecoats when I was a boy. My mother raised me to follow his path to protect our people." "Is she still alive?" Ruth asked. "Yes. She is an elder now, respected for her wisdom." Chogan's voice held deep affection. "She will like you." The simple certainty of his words warmed Ruth more than the fire. "How can you be so sure?" "Because you are true," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You do not wear a false face." That night, as the mountain chill deepened, Chogan drew Ruth into his arms for warmth. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt a peace she had never known before. On the fourth day of their journey, they crested a ridge, and Chogan suddenly tensed, raising a hand for Ruth to stop. "What is it?" she whispered, alarmed by the change in his demeanor. He pointed to a thin column of smoke rising from the valley below. "That is not my people's fire." Ruth squinted, trying to see what had concerned him. "Could it be travelers? Or settlers?" "No." Chogan's face was grim. "This is close to our summer grounds. No white settlers come this far." He studied the smoke for a long moment. "We must be careful. Follow me and stay low." They made their way down the slope, moving from tree to tree for cover. Chogan's movements were silent, precise. Ruth did her best to mimic him, wincing when her foot dislodged a small stone that clattered down the hill. As they drew closer to the source of the smoke, Chogan motioned for Ruth to wait. He crept forward alone, disappearing into the underbrush. Ruth held her breath, counting the seconds until he returned. When he finally reappeared, his expression was dark with anger and concern. "Soldiers," he whispered, "a small party, 6 men. They are camped by the stream." Ruth's heart sank. "Army? What are they doing way out here?" "Hunting," Chogan said, his voice hard. "Not for game, but for my people. I have seen this before. Small parties that range ahead of larger forces, searching for our camps." "What do we do?" Ruth asked, fear building in her chest. If these soldiers found them, a lone Apache man traveling with a white woman, the consequences would be dire. Chogan considered their options. "We must go around them. It will add a day to our journey, but it is safer." They backtracked and began a wide arc around the soldiers' position. The detour took them through difficult terrain, steep slopes covered in loose shale that threatened to give way beneath their feet. dense thickets of thorny brush that tore at their clothing and skin. By nightfall, they were exhausted but had successfully avoided the patrol. They made camp in a small cave, not daring to light a fire, despite the mountain cold. "Will there be more soldiers?" Ruth asked, as they shared the last of their dried meat. "Perhaps." Chogan's face was shadowed in the darkness. "The Bluecoats have been pushing deeper into our territory each season. It is why many of our bands have moved higher into the mountains." Ruth pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. "And your people? Are they safe?" "For now, the summer camp is well hidden." Chogan hesitated. "But we cannot stay there forever. Game grows scarce, and the winters are harsh." The reality of what she had chosen began to settle on Ruth. She had left one set of troubles behind, only to face new ones. The life awaiting her would not be easy. Seeing her expression, Chogan moved closer. "You are having doubts," he said. It wasn't a question. Ruth shook her head. "Not doubts. Just seeing things clearly. I knew it wouldn't be easy. But now you are truly understanding what it means to be with my people," Chogan finished for her. "To be hunted, to always watch the horizon for enemies." "Yes." There was no point denying it. Chogan took her hand, his touch gentle, despite the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of survival. "You can still turn back, I would understand." Ruth looked at him, at the face that had become so dear to her in such a short time. "And go where? Back to a town that never wanted me? To a house that was more prison than home?" She squeezed his hand. "No. My path is forward now. With you." The smile that crossed Chogan's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. He leaned forward, and for the first time, his lips met hers in a kiss that spoke of promise and belonging. Ruth felt something inside her unlock, a door she had kept barred for so long she'd forgotten it existed. When they broke apart, Chogan rested his forehead against hers. "You are brave," Ruth called her, he whispered. "Braver than any warrior I have known." They slept that night wrapped in each other's arms, the cold stone of the cave floor forgotten in the warmth they created together. The next morning dawned clear and cold. As they prepared to continue their journey, Chogan suddenly froze, his head cocked to one side. "What?" Ruth began, but he quickly pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Now she heard it too. Voices carried on the wind, men's voices speaking English, and they were getting closer. "The soldiers," Chogan whispered. "They are coming this way." There was no time to flee. The cave entrance offered the only way out, and beyond it the sound of approaching men grew louder by the second. "Stay here," Chogan said, reaching for the knife at his belt. "I will lead them away." "No!" Ruth grabbed his arm. "There are too many of them. They'll kill you." "I cannot let them find you with me," Chogan insisted. "If they do, we'll think of something else," Ruth said, her mind racing. Then an idea struck her, desperate, risky, but possibly their only chance. "I'll say you captured me, that you took me from my home." Chogan stared at her. "They will not believe it." "They might. Men like that, they believe what's easy, what fits what they already think." Ruth spoke quickly, the plan forming as she went. "I'll say you've been holding me prisoner, that I've been waiting for a chance to escape. Then, when they're focused on me, you can slip away." "And leave you alone with them?" Chogan shook his head. "No. It's our only chance," Ruth insisted. "They won't hurt a white woman. They'll take me back to a settlement, and I'll find my way to you after." "How? You don't even know where the summer camp is." "Then tell me. Now quickly." The voices were very close now. Any moment, the soldiers would discover the cave. With reluctance etched on his face, Chogan gave Ruth directions to his people's camp, landmarks to watch for, paths to follow. "But this plan is too dangerous," he added. "If they suspect you of helping me—" "They won't," Ruth touched his face. "Trust me." Before he could protest further, Ruth tore at her dress, smudged dirt on her face, and mussed her hair. She pinched her cheeks to bring color to them, then bit her lip hard enough to make it swell slightly. "Go," she whispered. Hide deeper in the cave. When I've drawn them away, run. I'll find you, I promise. Chogan hesitated, then pulled her to him for one fierce, desperate kiss. Be careful, he murmured against her lips. Then he melted into the shadows at the back of the cave. Ruth took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Then she ran to the cave entrance and burst out into the morning light, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Help! Please, help me!" The soldiers, who had been making their way up the slope, stopped in shock. Then they rushed forward, rifles at the ready. "Ma'am? Ma'am, are you all right?" The leader of the group, a sergeant with a thick mustache, reached her first. Ruth collapsed to her knees, summoning tears. "Oh, thank God," she sobbed. I thought I'd die out here." "What happened to you, ma'am? What are you doing out here alone?" The sergeant signaled for his men to spread out, scanning the area for threats. "I wasn't alone," Ruth gasped between sobs. "He took me from my home, an Apache." The men exchanged knowing glances, their expressions hardening. "Where is he now, ma'am?" the sergeant asked, his hand tightening on his rifle. Ruth pointed in the opposite direction from the cave. "He went that way, hunting. I've been waiting for a chance to run. Please, you have to help me." "Jenkins, Miller, check the cave," the sergeant ordered two of his men. "Could be others." Ruth's heart hammered in her chest. This wasn't part of the plan. "No," she said quickly. "He's alone. He told me his people are far from here." "Better to be sure, ma'am," the sergeant said, not unkindly. "Can't be too careful with these savages." Ruth watched in helpless terror as the two soldiers approached the cave. Had Chogan found a hiding place? Or would they discover him? The soldiers disappeared into the cave mouth. Seconds stretched like hours as Ruth waited, hardly daring to breathe. When the men emerged, she nearly fainted with relief. "All clear, Sarge," one reported. "Just some old ashes from a fire. Looks like they camped there last night." The sergeant nodded. "All right, ma'am, you're safe now. We'll get you back to Fort Dawson. It's about 2 days' ride from here." Ruth allowed herself to be helped to her feet, playing the part of the traumatized victim. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I'd never see civilization again." As the soldiers prepared to leave, gathering their gear and helping Ruth onto a spare horse, she cast one last glance at the cave. There was no sign of Chogan, but she knew he was watching. Somehow, she would find her way back to him. The journey to Fort Dawson was grueling in its own way. Ruth maintained her deception, telling the soldiers a carefully crafted story about being taken from her homestead near Las Cruces. She claimed to have been held captive for weeks, though she was careful to imply that her Apache captor hadn't dishonored her, knowing that such a claim would only fuel the soldiers' bloodlust and might prompt them to hunt Chogan more aggressively. The sergeant, whose name was Daniels, treated her with gruff courtesy. The other men were more openly curious, peppering her with questions about her ordeal, until Daniels ordered them to leave her be. "Don't mind them, ma'am," he told her as they rode. "Some of these boys have never even seen an Apache up close, let alone talk to a lady who's been through what you have." Ruth nodded, keeping her eyes downcast as a properly traumatized woman should. "What were you doing so far into the mountains?" she asked, hoping to learn more about the military presence in the area. "Scouting," Daniels replied. "Got reports of a large band of Apache moving through these parts. Colonel wants to know where they're settling for the summer so we can keep an eye on them." "Are you planning to attack them?" Ruth tried to keep her voice neutral. Daniels glanced at her. "Not our decision, ma'am. We just report what we find. But between you and me, the Colonel's under pressure to show results. Too many settlers getting raided. Too many complaints reaching all the way to Washington." Ruth's heart sank. It was as Chogan had said. His people were running out of places to hide, out of time to live in peace. Fort Dawson turned out to be a substantial military post situated at the edge of the mountains, where the terrain began to flatten out toward the desert. Wooden buildings surrounded a central parade ground, with a tall flagpole flying the American flag at its center. As they rode through the gates, Ruth felt every eye turn toward her, a disheveled white woman in the company of Army scouts. Word of her arrival spread quickly, and by the time Sergeant Daniels helped her down from her horse, a crowd had gathered. An officer in a crisp uniform pushed through the onlookers. "Sergeant, report," he barked. Found this lady in the high country, sir, Daniels replied with a salute. Says she was taken captive by an Apache, managed to escape when he went hunting. We searched but couldn't locate the Indian. The officer turned to Ruth, his expression a mixture of concern and suspicion. I'm Captain Thomas Reed, ma'am. You're safe now. We'll get you some proper food and clothing, and the post doctor should take a look at you. Ruth was escorted to a small room in what appeared to be the officer's quarters. A young soldier's wife brought her a clean dress and helped her wash up, clucking sympathetically over Ruth's appearance. You poor thing, the woman said. To think of you in the hands of those savages, it's a miracle you survived. Ruth murmured appropriately grateful responses, while inwardly cringing at the woman's words. How quickly would that sympathy turn to horror if she knew the truth, that Ruth had chosen to go with Chogan, that she loved him. The post doctor, a kindly older man with spectacles perched on his nose, examined her briefly and pronounced her surprisingly healthy, given her supposed ordeal. Quite remarkable, actually, he commented. Most captives we recover are in far worse condition. You must be very resilient, Miss Calder. I've always been strong, Ruth replied carefully. And he didn't treat me as badly as he might have. The doctor raised his eyebrows but didn't comment further. That evening, Ruth was summoned to the captain's office. She found him seated behind a desk piled with maps and reports. Another man, tall, distinguished with silver at his temples, stood nearby. Miss Calder, Captain Reed said, rising as she entered. Please have a seat. This is Colonel William Hargrove, commanding officer of Fort Dawson. Ruth nodded politely to both men, her nerves on edge. She sat in the offered chair, folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. Miss Calder, the colonel began, your story is most interesting. We don't often hear of lone Apache warriors taking captives. Usually it's raiding parties. He said he was separated from his band, Ruth replied, sticking to her story. There was a storm. He found my homestead. I see. The colonel's keen eyes studied her face. And during your time with him, did he mention where his people might be camped? Any landmarks or locations? Ruth's heart beat faster. This was dangerous territory. No, sir, he was careful not to tell me anything like that. Kept me blindfolded when we traveled during the day. The colonel exchanged a glance with Captain Reed. That's a shame. We're trying to locate these Apache bands before there's more bloodshed. If we know where they are, we can keep settlers away from those areas, prevent more incidents like what happened to you. The reasonable tone, the seemingly benevolent intent. Ruth almost believed him, but she remembered Chogan's words about previous encounters with the army, about broken treaties and massacred camps. I wish I could help, Colonel, she said, but I truly don't know where they are. Colonel Hargrove sighed. Very well, we'll arrange transport for you to the nearest town once you've had a chance to recover. Unless, he paused, unless you'd consider helping us in another way. Ruth tensed. How? Your experience gives you unique insight, Miss Calder. You've spent time with these people, observed them. If you were to accompany one of our scouting parties, you might recognize signs we would miss. You want me to help you track them down? Ruth couldn't keep the shock from her voice. To establish peaceful contact, the colonel clarified smoothly. To prevent more violence. Ruth knew a lie when she heard one. After years of dealing with men like Sheriff Miles, she recognized the false sincerity, the hidden agenda behind the pleasant words. I'm afraid I wouldn't be of much use, she said. As I told you, I was kept isolated, and I'm eager to return to civilization. The word tasted bitter on her tongue. The colonel nodded, though disappointment flashed across his face. Of course, I understand completely. You've been through quite enough already. Ruth was dismissed shortly after, with assurances that arrangements would be made for her departure within a few days. As she walked back to her assigned quarters, her mind raced. She needed to escape this fort and find her way to Chogan and his people, to warn them about the army's search if nothing else. But Fort Dawson was well guarded, its gates watched day and night. She was given freedom to move about within the fort, but a lone woman departing on foot would raise immediate suspicion. She needed another plan. Her opportunity came the next day. While taking a meal in the small mess hall reserved for officers and visitors, Ruth overheard a conversation between two young lieutenants. Supply train leaves tomorrow at dawn, one was saying. Henderson's leading the escort back to Las Cruces. Rather him than me, the other replied with a laugh. 2 days on the trail with those teamsters. They smell worse than their mules. Ruth's pulse quickened. A supply train heading south, away from the mountains but also away from the fort. It wasn't ideal, but it might be her best chance to get beyond the watchful eyes of the soldiers. That afternoon she sought out Captain Reed, putting on her most vulnerable expression. "Captain," she said, letting her voice waver slightly. "I've heard there's a supply train leaving for Las Cruces tomorrow." Reed nodded. "That's right. Why do you ask, Miss Calder?" "I was hoping I might travel with it." Ruth twisted her hands in her lap. "Being here, surrounded by so many reminders of what happened. It's more difficult than I expected. I'm anxious to put some distance between myself and these mountains." The captain's expression softened with understanding. "Of course. I'll speak to Lieutenant Henderson. It's not the most comfortable way to travel, but if you're certain—" "I am," Ruth said quickly. "I'm used to hardship, Captain. I just want to go." By evening, it was arranged. Ruth would depart with the supply train at dawn, traveling under the protection of Lieutenant Henderson and his small escort of soldiers. From Las Cruces, the army would help her make arrangements to reach whatever destination she chose. Ruth spent a restless night, her mind filled with thoughts of Chogan. Had he made it safely to his people? Was he worried about her? Did he believe she would find her way back to him? Before first light, she was ready, dressed in the simple clothes provided by the fort, and carrying a small bundle of supplies given to her by the sympathetic doctor. Lieutenant Henderson, a fresh-faced young man who couldn't have been more than 25, greeted her with awkward courtesy. "Miss Calder," he said with a slight bow, "we're honored to escort you. I've arranged for you to ride in the lead wagon. It's the least uncomfortable of the lot." "Thank you, Lieutenant. You're very kind." The supply train consisted of 4 large wagons, each pulled by a team of mules and driven by civilian teamsters, who, as the lieutenant had suggested, were a rough-looking bunch. 8 soldiers on horseback made up the escort. As they prepared to depart, Colonel Hargrove appeared to see them off. He approached Ruth, his manner pleasant, but his eyes still watchful. "Miss Calder," he said, "I wish you a safe journey. When you reach Las Cruces, please give my regards to Sheriff Collins. He's an old friend." Ruth nodded, though her stomach tightened at the mention of another sheriff. "I will, Colonel. Thank you for your hospitality. One more thing," Hargrove added, his voice lowering. "If you should happen to recall anything about your captivity, anything that might help us locate these Apache, a letter addressed to me at Fort Dawson would find its way to my desk." "I'll keep that in mind," Ruth replied, meeting his gaze steadily. The colonel held her eyes for a moment longer, then stepped back with a nod. "Safe travels, Miss Calder." The gates of Fort Dawson opened, and the supply train rumbled through. Ruth sat beside the teamster in the lead wagon, feeling the colonel's eyes on her back until they rounded a bend in the trail, and the fort disappeared from view. The journey south was slow and jarring. The trail was rough, the wagon seats hard, and the company limited. Lieutenant Henderson rode alongside occasionally, making polite conversation, but mostly Ruth was left to her thoughts. By midday, they had descended from the foothills into more open country. Ruth watched the mountains receding behind them, knowing that with each mile she was moving farther from Chogan, but she was also moving away from the fort, gaining freedom of movement that she would need to circle back. They made camp that evening beside a small creek. The teamsters set up a fire and prepared a simple meal while the soldiers established a perimeter. Ruth kept to herself, observing, planning. Lieutenant Henderson approached as she sat alone, offering her a tin cup of coffee. "Not what you're used to, I expect," he said apologetically, "but it's hot." Ruth accepted the cup with a small smile. "I've had worse, Lieutenant, thank you." The young officer hesitated, then sat nearby. "If you don't mind my asking, Miss Calder, where will you go once we reach Las Cruces? Do you have family waiting?" "No family," Ruth replied truthfully. "I'm not sure yet where I'll settle." Henderson nodded sympathetically. "I understand. After what you've been through, you probably want a fresh start." He looked toward the distant mountains. It's a shame what these raids have done to folks like you, peaceful settlers just trying to make a life. Ruth took a sip of the bitter coffee to avoid responding immediately. This young man wasn't malicious, she realized. He truly believed in the rightness of what he was doing. "Lieutenant," she said carefully, "in your experience, why do the Apache raid settlements?" Henderson looked surprised by the question. "Well, for plunder mainly. Livestock, weapons, supplies, and to drive settlers off what they consider their land." He frowned, "Though that doesn't excuse their savagery." "And the settlers?" Ruth pressed. "Have they always treated the Apache fairly?" The lieutenant shifted uncomfortably. "I suppose not always. There have been incidents, misunderstandings. But we have treaties now, reservations where they can live in peace. If someone came to your home and told you where you could and couldn't live, would you go peacefully?" The words were out before Ruth could stop them. Henderson stared at her, confusion evident on his young face. "Miss Calder, that's hardly the same, isn't it?" Ruth set down her cup. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant. I'm tired, and my mind wanders. Please don't mind me." The officer stood, clearly unsettled by the turn in conversation. "Of course, you should rest. We have another long day tomorrow." As he walked away, Ruth cursed herself silently. She needed to be more careful. Questions like those would only raise suspicions about her story. That night, as the camp settled into sleep, Ruth lay awake, watching the stars and listening to the sounds of the men on watch. The mountains loomed dark against the night sky, calling to her. Somewhere in those heights Chogan waited, or perhaps he had already given her up for lost. "I'm coming," she whispered to the stars. "Wait for me." The second day of travel brought them to the outskirts of Las Cruces by nightfall. They camped one last time, with the lights of the town visible in the distance. Ruth knew her window of opportunity was closing. Once they reached the town, she would be handed over to this Sheriff Collins, and her chances of escape would dwindle further. She had to act tonight. After supper, when the camp was settling down, Ruth approached Lieutenant Henderson with her most vulnerable expression. "Lieutenant," she said softly, "I hate to trouble you, but I need to... That is, I require a moment of privacy." She glanced meaningfully toward the darkness beyond the campfire. Henderson flushed slightly. "Of course, Miss Calder. Davis," he called to one of his men, "escort Miss Calder to a suitable spot for our privacy and wait at a respectful distance." The young soldier named Davis nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the assignment. He led Ruth away from the camp, toward a cluster of scrub brush about 50 yards distant. "I'll wait here, ma'am," he said, turning his back politely. "Just call when you're ready to return." Ruth slipped behind the brush, her heart pounding. This was her chance, perhaps her only one. The darkness would cover her for a while, but by morning they would realize she was gone and raise the alarm. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Then, as silently as she could, she began to move away from the camp, staying low and using the brush for cover. She had watched the mountains carefully during the day's travel, noting landmarks. Now she oriented herself by the stars, heading northeast back toward the high country. Behind her, she could hear Private Davis shuffling his feet, waiting patiently. It wouldn't be long before he called out to check on her. She needed to put as much distance as possible between them before then. Ruth moved faster, abandoning stealth for speed as soon as she was far enough from the camp that the sound of her footsteps wouldn't carry. The bundle of supplies from the fort bounced against her back as she ran. Food, a canteen of water, a small knife. Not much, but it would have to do. She had learned more from Chogan in their brief time together than she had realized. How to move across country, how to find water, how to navigate by the stars. Now she put those lessons to use, pushing herself through the darkness toward the mountains that held her heart. Behind her, she finally heard a voice calling, "Miss Calder, are you all right?" Followed by more urgent shouts as her absence was discovered. Soon the camp was in an uproar, lanterns moving in the darkness as the soldiers began to search. But Ruth was already gone, swallowed by the night, running toward a future she had chosen for herself. A future with a man who saw her truly, and a people who might in time become her own. The journey back to the mountains was arduous. Ruth traveled by night and hid during the day, knowing that soldiers from Fort Dawson would be searching for her. She kept to dry, rocky ground when possible to avoid leaving tracks, another trick she had learned from Chogan. Her supplies dwindled quickly. The water was gone by the second day, forcing her to search for streams and springs. Food became a constant worry. She gathered what edible plants she recognized, remembering Chogan's lessons, but it wasn't enough to keep her strength up. By the fourth day, as she began to climb into the foothills, Ruth was exhausted and lightheaded with hunger. Her boots were falling apart, her feet blistered and bleeding. But still she pushed on, following the landmarks Chogan had described. A distinctive twin-peaked mountain, a waterfall that split around a giant boulder, a meadow shaped like a crescent moon. On the fifth day, she reached the high meadow where Chogan had said his people made their summer camp. But as she crested the final ridge, her heart sank. The meadow was empty, no teepees, no fires, no signs of the Apache band. Had she misunderstood his directions, or had his people moved on, perhaps warned by Chogan of the soldiers' presence in the area? Ruth sank to her knees, too tired and disappointed to go any further. After everything, leaving her home, deceiving the soldiers, escaping the supply train, the long journey back, to find nothing felt like a cruel joke. As the sun began to set, Ruth gathered her remaining strength and made her way to a small cluster of trees at the edge of the meadow. She would rest for the night and decide what to do in the morning, though what options she had left she couldn't imagine. She was arranging branches for a crude shelter when a sound behind her made her freeze. A twig snapping underfoot, the soft rustle of movement. Someone was there. Ruth turned slowly, her hand going to the small knife at her belt, the only weapon she had. A figure stepped out of the lengthening shadows, tall, straight-backed, with long dark hair and eyes that Ruth would have recognized anywhere. "Chogan," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it was really him. His face, normally so composed, broke into an expression of wonder and joy. "Ruth!" He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and gathered her into his arms. "I thought I had lost you." Ruth clung to him, tears streaming down her face. "I told you I'd find you." Chogan held her as if he feared she might disappear, his hands tangled in her hair, his face buried against her neck. "How did you escape? When the soldiers took you, I feared—" "It's a long story," Ruth said, pulling back just enough to see his face in the fading light. "But I'm here now, that's what matters." Chogan cupped her face in his hands, his eyes taking in every detail, the scratches on her cheeks, the exhaustion in her eyes, the determination still evident in the set of her jaw. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known," he said softly. And then he kissed her with a passion that made Ruth forget her exhaustion, her hunger, everything except this moment and this man. When they finally broke apart, Chogan looked around the empty meadow. "You were looking for our camp." Ruth nodded. "You said your people would be here." "They were, but after I returned and told them about the soldiers, we decided to move higher into the mountains to a place even more difficult to find." He smiled slightly. "I have been coming back here every day, hoping you would remember the way." "You waited for me," Ruth said, a lump forming in her throat. "I would have waited forever." The simple certainty in his voice was a balm to her soul. That night, in a small cave hidden from view, Chogan tended to Ruth's injuries, fed her, and listened as she told him everything that had happened since their separation, the deception at Fort Dawson, her escape from the supply train, her journey back to find him. "You risked everything," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I made my choice," Ruth replied simply. "Back at my house, when I stood against Sheriff Miles, I chose you, Chogan. I chose us." In the soft glow of the small fire, Chogan reached for the leather cord around his neck and pulled out a small pouch. From it he took a ring made of intricately woven silver strands. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said. "In my tribe, when 2 souls find each other, when they choose to walk the same path, they exchange tokens of their bond." Ruth's breath caught in her throat as Chogan took her hand. Ruth called her, "Will you walk beside me for all the days to come? Will you be my wife in the ways of my people?" Tears filled Ruth's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Chogan slid the silver ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. In return, Ruth reached for the locket she wore, a simple silver oval that had belonged to her mother, the only piece of jewelry she had brought with her. "This was my mother's," she said, removing it from her neck. "It's all I have left of her." Chogan bowed his head as she placed the chain around his neck, the locket resting against his chest. "I will honor it, and her memory always." That night, under the blanket of stars visible through the cave entrance, they became husband and wife in the most ancient way, with whispered promises and the joining of bodies and souls. Ruth gave herself fully to Chogan, and he to her, sealing their bond with passion and tenderness. As dawn broke, casting rosy light into their shelter, Chogan kissed Ruth awake. "Come," he said. "It is time for you to meet my people." The journey to the new camp took most of the day, climbing higher into the mountains than Ruth had ever been. By the time they crested the final ridge, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across a hidden valley nestled between towering peaks. Below them, Ruth could see teepees arranged in a circle around central fire pits. People moved about the camp, women tending to cooking fires, men working with hides or weapons, children playing games in the open spaces. "It's beautiful," Ruth said, taking in the scene. Chogan squeezed her hand. "It is home." As they descended into the valley, people began to notice their approach. Children pointed, women paused in their work, and several men moved to meet them. Ruth felt a flutter of nervousness. Would Chogan's people accept her, a white woman, or would they see her as an enemy? An older woman stepped forward from the gathering crowd. Her long black hair was streaked with silver, and her face bore the lines of many winters, but she stood tall and proud. From the way Chogan straightened beside her, Ruth knew immediately who this must be. "Mother," Chogan said in Apache, then switched to English for Ruth's benefit. "I have returned and I have brought the woman I told you about. This is Ruth." The older woman's dark eyes studied Ruth intently, taking in her torn dress, her blistered feet, the exhaustion evident in her stance. Then her gaze moved to the silver ring on Ruth's finger and the absence of the locket around her son's neck. "You have already performed the bonding ceremony," she said, her English accented but clear. "Yes," Chogan replied. "Ruth is my wife." A murmur ran through the gathered tribe members. Ruth held her breath, waiting for the older woman's response. Slowly, Chogan's mother stepped forward and took Ruth's hands in her own. "My son told me of a woman with a warrior's heart who stood between him and his enemies," she said. "Now I see she also has a lover's devotion to have found her way back to him against such odds." The woman's hands were warm and strong, her grip firm, but not unkind. "I am Kilenya," she said. "Welcome to our family, Ruth." Relief washed over Ruth like a wave. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. That night, a feast was held to welcome Ruth and celebrate her union with Chogan. Though some tribe members remained wary of the white woman in their midst, most followed Kilenya's lead in accepting her. As they sat around the central fire, sharing food and stories, Ruth felt a sense of belonging she had never known before, not in her father's house, certainly not in the town that had always viewed her as an outsider. Here, among people who should have been her enemies, she had found a place where she could be herself. Chogan, sitting beside her, leaned close to whisper in her ear, "Are you happy?" Ruth looked around at the circle of faces illuminated by firelight, at the majestic mountains surrounding their hidden valley, and finally, at the man who had changed her life with a single word, "Please," spoken at her door during a storm. "Yes," she said, squeezing his hand, "for the first time, I truly am." But even as she spoke the words, Ruth knew their challenges were far from over. The soldiers at Fort Dawson would not stop searching for the Apache bands. The world beyond these mountains was changing, growing smaller, more dangerous for people like Chogan and his tribe. Yet for tonight, in this moment, there was peace. There was belonging. There was love. And for Ruth Calder, now Ruth of the Apache, that was enough to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Summer faded into autumn in the high mountains. The leaves of the aspen trees turned gold, creating brilliant patches of color among the dark pines. Ruth learned the ways of her new family, how to prepare hides for clothing, how to weave baskets tight enough to hold water, how to move silently through the forest. It wasn't always easy. Some tribe members remained suspicious of her, watching her with wary eyes. The language barrier created misunderstandings, and the physical demands of mountain life tested Ruth's endurance daily. But there were joys too, deep soul-filling joys that made every hardship worthwhile. The acceptance in Kilenya's eyes as Ruth mastered a new skill, the laughter of children who had begun to seek her out, fascinated by her different ways, and most of all the love she shared with Chogan, growing stronger with each passing day. "You have good hands," Kilenya told her one afternoon as they worked together preparing a deer hide. "Strong but gentle, the same way you touch my son." Ruth blushed, still not entirely used to the Apache's directness about such matters. "I want to be useful," she said, "to contribute." Kilenya nodded approvingly. "Many of our tribe feared you would be weak, unable to live our way. But I see your strength. It is different from ours, but no less real." "Thank you," Ruth said, touched by the older woman's words. Over the weeks, she had come to deeply respect Chogan's mother, her wisdom, her quiet authority, her resilience in the face of hardship. "The cold time comes soon," Kilenya continued, her expression growing serious. "We must decide whether to stay in these high places or move to the winter grounds below." Ruth knew this decision had been weighing on the tribal council. The winter grounds, while more sheltered and game-rich, were closer to settled areas, and thus more dangerous. But remaining in the high country meant facing bitter cold and possible starvation if the snows came heavy. "What does Chogan think?" Ruth asked. "My son's heart is torn," Kilenya replied. "He fears for our safety if we go down, but also if we stay." She gave Ruth a considering look. "Perhaps you could speak with him. Sometimes a wife sees paths a warrior cannot." That evening, as they sat by their small fire outside the teepee they shared, Ruth broached the subject with Chogan. "Your mother told me about the decision facing the council," she said. "About whether to go to the winter grounds." Chogan's face was grave in the firelight. "It is not an easy choice. The winter grounds offer better hunting, more shelter. But they are also closer to the white settlements, to Fort Dawson. And the soldiers are still searching for your people." "Yes." Chogan poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the night air. "2 hunters saw a patrol 3 days ago, moving through the western passes. They are persistent." Ruth thought about the colonel at Fort Dawson, about his keen eyes and smooth words. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "Men like that never do." Chogan looked at her, his expression softening. "I'm sorry. I have brought you into a difficult life." "No," Ruth said firmly, taking his hand. "I chose this life. I chose you." She hesitated, then added, "But I worry about the future. Not just this winter, but the winters to come. Your people can't keep running forever. What would you have us do? Surrender? Go to the reservation?" There was no anger in Chogan's voice, only a genuine question. Ruth shook her head. "I don't know, but I've been thinking there might be another way." "Tell me." Ruth had been mulling over an idea for weeks, uncertain whether to voice it. Now she took a deep breath and laid it out. "What if there was a place where your people could live in peace, but not on a reservation? Somewhere far from here, where the army and settlers haven't reached yet?" Chogan frowned. "Such places grow fewer each year." "What about north, into the territories, or even farther, across the border into Canada?" Chogan was silent for a long moment, considering. "It would be a difficult journey, dangerous, and there is no guarantee we would find welcome there. But it's a chance," Ruth pressed, "a chance for a future that doesn't end in bloodshed." "You have been talking to my mother," Chogan said with a small smile. "She has spoken of similar things." "She's wise," Ruth replied, "and she wants her people to survive." Chogan drew Ruth closer, his arm around her shoulders. "I will bring your words to the council, but such a journey would not begin until spring in any case. First, we must survive the winter." The council debated for 3 days. In the end, they decided to split the tribe. The elderly, the very young, and those who were ill would move to the winter grounds, while the stronger adults would remain in the high country to hunt and keep watch. When spring came, they would reunite and decide whether to begin the long journey north. The first snow fell 2 weeks later, dusting the pines and frosting the ground. More followed, until the world outside their teepee was a sea of white. The cold was unlike anything Ruth had ever experienced. A deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to freeze the very air in her lungs. But the Apache were well prepared. Their teepees were insulated with layers of hides, their winter clothing made of deer and elk skins with the fur turned inward. They built small, hot fires that gave warmth without too much smoke, and they slept close together, sharing body heat. Despite the preparations, it was a hard time. Game grew scarce as the snow deepened. Hunting parties would go out for days, returning with little to show for their efforts. Rations grew smaller. Children cried from hunger. The old and sick, who had gone to the winter grounds below, sent word that they too were struggling. One night, as a blizzard howled outside their teepee, Ruth lay awake beside Chogan, listening to the wind and thinking about the future. Her hand rested on her stomach, which had just begun to swell slightly with the child growing inside her. She hadn't told Chogan yet. In the midst of winter's hardships, she had been waiting for the right moment. But now, with hunger gnawing at them and the future so uncertain, she knew she couldn't wait any longer. "Chogan," she whispered, turning toward him in the darkness, "I need to tell you something." He was instantly alert, years of vigilance making him a light sleeper. "What is it?" Ruth took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "We're going to have a child," she said softly, "in the spring." Even in the dim light, she could see the wonder that spread across his face. "A child," he repeated, his voice filled with awe. "Our child." "Yes." Ruth bit her lip, uncertain how he would feel about bringing a new life into their precarious world. Chogan gathered her close, his hand still resting protectively over her belly. "This is a great blessing," he said, "a sign of hope for our future. You're not worried, with everything so uncertain." "Life is always uncertain," Chogan said simply. "But children are the reason we struggle, the reason we endure. They are the future." He kissed her forehead. "Thank you for this gift." Ruth felt tears of relief and joy sting her eyes. "I was afraid you might think the timing was bad." "The Great Spirit chooses the timing, not us." Chogan's voice was gentle but firm. "And I believe he is wise." The news of Ruth's pregnancy spread through the camp the next day, bringing a ray of hope to the winter-weary tribe. Even those who had been most suspicious of her seemed to soften, as if the child she carried was proof of her belonging. Kilenia was especially pleased, her usual reserve breaking into a rare, wide smile when Ruth confirmed what the older woman had already suspected. "I knew," she said, patting Ruth's stomach. "A grandmother knows these things. The child will be strong, like both parents." But as Ruth's body changed, nourishing the new life within, the tribe's resources continued to dwindle. By midwinter, hunger was a constant companion. Hunting parties ranged farther and farther, sometimes not returning for many days. Chogan led one such party, departing before dawn one morning with 5 other men. "We will go to the eastern valleys," he told Ruth. "There may be elk there that have not been hunted." Ruth held him tightly before he left, reluctant to let go. Something about this parting felt different, heavier with foreboding. "Be careful," she said. "Come back to us." Chogan placed his hand on her growing belly. "Always," he promised. 4 days passed with no sign of the hunting party, then 5. By the 6th day, worry had settled like a stone in Ruth's chest. Kilenia tried to reassure her. "My son knows these mountains better than anyone," she said. "Perhaps they have found game and are bringing back a large kill. That would take time." Ruth nodded, trying to believe the older woman's words. But as night fell on the 7th day with still no sign of Chogan and his men, even Kilenia's confidence began to waver. On the morning of the 8th day, as Ruth was helping with the communal breakfast, a thin stew, that did little to satisfy their hunger. A shout went up from the edge of the camp. "Riders! Coming from the east!" Ruth's heart leaped. The hunting party, returning at last. She rushed toward the sentry who had called out, Kilenia right behind her. But as they reached the lookout point, Ruth's hope turned to ash. It wasn't Chogan and his men approaching the camp. It was a column of soldiers on horseback, their blue uniforms stark against the snow. "How did they find us?" Kilenya whispered, her face ashen. Ruth counted at least 20 men, led by a figure she recognized with a sinking heart, Colonel Hargrove from Fort Dawson. How had they discovered the hidden camp? Had they captured Chogan and his hunting party, forced them to reveal the location? No, Ruth couldn't believe that. Chogan would die before betraying his people. The camp erupted into frantic activity. Warriors grabbed weapons, women gathered children, some began to flee toward the forest. But the soldiers were already surrounding the camp, cutting off escape routes. "Wait," Ruth said, grabbing Kilenya's arm. "Let me talk to them. I know their leader." Kilenya looked at her in shock. "You would reveal yourself after escaping them? If it can prevent bloodshed, yes." Ruth placed her hand protectively over her swollen belly. "For all our sakes." Before Kilenya could protest further, Ruth stepped forward, moving toward the approaching soldiers. She heard cries of alarm from the tribe behind her, but kept walking, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm. Colonel Hargrove reined in his horse as he saw her, his expression changing from grim determination to surprise. "Miss Calder," he said, his voice carrying across the snowy ground. "So this is where you disappeared to. We thought you dead or captured again." Ruth stood tall, refusing to show fear. "I wasn't captured, Colonel. Not the first time, and not now. I'm here by choice." The Colonel's eyes narrowed, taking in her appearance, the deerskin dress that accommodated her pregnancy, the Apache-style moccasins on her feet, the silver ring on her finger. "I see," he said coldly. "You've gone native, taken up with one of them." His gaze moved to her belly. "And more." "I found my place," Ruth replied steadily. "My husband is Chogan, a scout of this tribe. These are my people now." Murmurs ran through the ranks of soldiers. Some looked disgusted, others curious. Colonel Hargrove's face hardened. "You've committed treason, Miss Calder, aiding enemies of the United States." "They're not enemies," Ruth countered. "They're people trying to survive, to live in peace." "Peace?" The Colonel's laugh was harsh. "Is that what you call raiding settlements, stealing cattle, burning homesteads?" "This band has done none of those things," Ruth insisted. "They've been here in the high country, keeping to themselves. Not all of them." Hargrove gestured, and two soldiers rode forward, dragging something behind their horses. With horror, Ruth realized it was a travois bearing a body, an Apache man, bloody and still. "We found this raiding party attacking the Wilson homestead 3 days ago," Hargrove said coldly. "This one was killed, the others escaped, but we tracked them. They led us right to you." Ruth stared at the dead warrior, relief washing through her when she saw it wasn't Chogan. But the implication of the Colonel's words struck her like a physical blow. A raiding party, it couldn't be. Chogan and his men had gone hunting, not raiding. "You're lying," she said. "My husband and his men went hunting for elk, not to attack settlers." "Your husband is a murderer and a thief," Hargrove snapped, "and you're a traitor to your race. Stand aside, Miss Calder. We have orders to relocate this band to the reservation at San Carlos. Those who resist will be dealt with accordingly." Ruth didn't move. "There are children here, Colonel, elderly, women with babies. They've done nothing wrong." "I won't ask again," Hargrove warned, his hand moving to his pistol. "Stand aside." For a moment, Ruth was back at her adobe house, standing on the porch with her shotgun, facing down Sheriff Miles and his men, but this time she had no weapon. No way to fight back against 20 armed soldiers. What she did have was knowledge of the man before her, of his pride and his ambition. "If you attack this camp," she said, her voice carrying to all who could hear, "if you kill these innocent people, I will make sure everyone knows what really happened. I will write to every newspaper from here to Washington. I will tell them how the great Colonel Hargrove massacred women and children to advance his career." Hargrove's face flushed with anger. No one would believe the words of a woman who betrayed her own kind. "Are you certain?" Ruth challenged. "What about the men in your command? Will they all stay silent about killing unarmed women, about shooting children?" She saw uncertainty flicker in the eyes of some of the soldiers. Young men not so different from Lieutenant Henderson, who had escorted her toward Las Cruces. men who had signed up to be soldiers, not executioners. "What do you propose instead?" Hargrove asked, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "That we simply ride away and leave these savages to continue their raids?" "I propose a compromise," Ruth said, thinking quickly. "This band is already planning to leave these territories come spring, to travel north away from the settlements. Let them go in peace." "And why should I believe they'll keep such a promise?" "Because I'll stay at Fort Dawson as a hostage until they're gone," Ruth said, the words coming before she'd fully thought them through. "If there are any more raids, any attacks on settlers, you can hold me responsible." Behind her she heard Kilenya's gasp of dismay, but Ruth kept her eyes fixed on the colonel, watching him calculate, consider. "One woman is hardly sufficient guarantee," he said finally. "Then take me too," came a familiar voice from behind Ruth. She whirled to see Kilenya stepping forward, her head high, her bearing regal despite her advanced years. "I am the mother of the war chief," Kilenya said in clear English. "If my son or any of our warriors break this agreement, you may punish me alongside this woman who carries my grandchild." Ruth's eyes filled with tears at the older woman's courage. "Kilenya, no," she whispered. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Kilenya replied softly. "For our people, for the future." Her hand briefly touched Ruth's belly, a gesture of blessing and farewell. Colonel Hargrove looked between the two women, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Very well, you will both return with us to Fort Dawson. The rest of the tribe has until the first day of spring to be gone from this territory. If they remain, or if there are any more raids, you will face the consequences." Relief washed through Ruth. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than a massacre, and perhaps by the time spring arrived, she could find a way to escape with Kilenya and rejoin the tribe on their journey north. As the soldiers prepared to depart with their two hostages, Ruth turned to the gathered tribe members. "Tell Chogan what has happened," she said in the Apache language she had been learning. "Tell him not to try to rescue us. The safety of the tribe must come first." An older warrior stepped forward. "We will tell him, and we will be ready to travel north when the snow melts. The council has already decided." Ruth nodded, grateful that at least that much was settled. "Take care of each other," she said. "We will find a way to return to you." As she and Kilenya were helped onto horses, Ruth cast one last look at the camp that had become her home. Somewhere out there, Chogan was still hunting, unaware that his wife and mother had sacrificed their freedom for his people's safety. "Be alive," she whispered into the cold mountain air. "Find us." The journey to Fort Dawson took 3 days. Ruth and Kilenya were treated with cold courtesy by Colonel Hargrove, though some of the younger soldiers showed small kindnesses, an extra blanket, a portion of food, help mounting and dismounting as Ruth's pregnancy made riding increasingly uncomfortable. At the fort, they were given a small room in the officers' quarters rather than the stockade, a concession to Ruth's condition and Kilenya's age. It was sparsely furnished but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a small stove for warmth. "You will remain here until your tribe has departed the territory," Colonel Hargrove informed them. "You will be treated fairly as long as you cooperate." "And after?" Ruth asked. "When my people have gone, will you release us to follow them?" The colonel's expression gave nothing away. "That will be determined at the appropriate time." After he left, Kilenya sat on one of the beds, her face lined with weariness. "He has no intention of letting us go," she said quietly. "I know," Ruth admitted, sinking onto the other bed. "But I bought our people time. And time is what we needed." Kilenya studied her with those keen, dark eyes. "You are truly one of us now," she said. "You think first of the tribe, not yourself." "I think of my child," Ruth said, resting her hand on her belly, "and of Chogan." "My son will come for us," Kilenya said with certainty, "but he will be wise about it. He will not risk the tribe." Days passed into weeks. January turned to February, and still they remained confined to their small room, allowed out only for brief, supervised walks around the fort's parade ground. Ruth's pregnancy progressed, her belly growing larger, the child within becoming more active. "A strong one," Kilenya would say, placing her hand on Ruth's stomach to feel the baby kick. "A warrior's spirit." They had no news of the tribe, no way of knowing if Chogan had returned from his hunting trip, if he knew what had happened, if the preparations for the journey north were proceeding. The uncertainty was a constant ache in Ruth's heart. One evening in late February, as a late winter storm howled around the fort, the door to their room opened to admit not the usual guard with their supper, but Captain Reed. "Miss Calder," he said, his manner formal but not unkind, "the Colonel requests your presence in his office." Ruth exchanged a glance with Kilenia, who nodded encouragingly. "Very well," she said, rising awkwardly due to her advanced pregnancy. Captain Reed escorted her across the parade ground to the administration building, his arm supporting her against the buffeting wind. Inside the Colonel's office, a fire burned in the grate, the warmth a stark contrast to the cold room she shared with Kilenia. Colonel Hargrove stood as she entered, gesturing to a chair. "Sit, please, Miss Calder. In your condition, you shouldn't remain standing." Ruth sat warily, uncertain of the purpose behind this unexpected summons. "What do you want, Colonel?" Hargrove paced behind his desk, his manner unusually agitated. "We've received reports," he said without preamble. "Disturbing reports from the settlements near the mountains." Ruth tensed. "What kind of reports?" "Raids. Brutal ones. 3 homesteads attacked in the past week. Livestock taken, buildings burned." Hargrove stopped pacing to fix her with a hard stare. "People killed." "It wasn't my tribe," Ruth said immediately. "They gave their word." "Words mean little when hunger bites," the Colonel replied, "and this winter has been harsh." "You're wrong," Ruth insisted. "They wouldn't break their promise, not when Kilenia and I are here as hostages." "Perhaps they don't care about your safety as much as you believe." Hargrove's tone was deliberately cruel. "Or perhaps they never intended to honor the agreement in the first place." Ruth struggled to remain calm, to think clearly. "Have you caught any of the raiders? Seen them with your own eyes?" "Not yet, but we will." Hargrove leaned forward, his hands flat on his desk. "And when we do, remember that you vouched for these people. Whatever blood they've spilled is on your hands too." Ruth stood, anger giving her strength despite her ungainly state. "You're lying," she said flatly. "You're trying to turn me against my husband, against his people. It won't work." Hargrove's expression darkened. "Be careful, Miss Calder. Your position here is precarious at best. Don't make it worse with accusations." "Then don't make false claims about my tribe," Ruth shot back. "If there have been raids, look elsewhere for the culprits." The Colonel studied her for a long moment, his eyes cold. "You may return to your quarters," he said finally. "But this discussion is not over." As Captain Reed escorted her back across the parade ground, Ruth's mind raced. Was Hargrove telling the truth about the raids? Or was it a ploy to justify breaking his word, to pursue the tribe despite the agreement? "Captain," she said as they neared her quarters, "what do you know about these raids the Colonel mentioned?" Reed hesitated, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "They're real enough," he said quietly. 3 homesteads hit hard. But, he trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "But what?" Ruth pressed. "The attacks don't match the pattern we've seen from Apache raids," Reed admitted. "Too much unnecessary violence. Apache take what they need and go. These raiders," he shook his head, "it's different." Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. "Thank you for telling me," she said as they reached her door. Inside, she relayed the conversation to Kilenia, whose face grew grave as she listened. "Other tribes, perhaps," the older woman suggested, "or bandits using the Apache as cover for their crimes." "Either way, Hargrove will use it as an excuse to go after our people," Ruth said, pacing the small room despite her exhaustion. "We need to warn them somehow." Kilenia nodded slowly. "There may be a way. Among my people, I am known as a healer. I could request herbs, things that grow even in winter. Perhaps during such a gathering, a message could be passed," Ruth finished, understanding immediately. "It's worth trying." The next morning, Kilenia made her request to Captain Reed, who seemed sympathetic to the older woman's desire to prepare traditional medicines for Ruth's approaching delivery. With the Colonel's reluctant permission, Kilenia was allowed to go into the hills near the fort, accompanied by 2 soldiers to gather what she needed. When she returned that evening, her basket held various plants and roots, but her eyes held something else, a message. "Our people are safe," she whispered to Ruth after the door had closed behind the guards. "I was able to speak briefly with a scout who watches the fort. Chogan has returned. He knows what we did." "Thank God," Ruth breathed, relief making her lightheaded. "What else?" "The tribe prepares for the journey north. They will leave with the first thaw." Kilenya's voice dropped even lower. "And Chogan has a plan to free us before they go." Ruth's heart leaped with hope, then just as quickly fell. "But it's too dangerous. The fort is well guarded." "My son is clever," Kilenya said with quiet pride. "And he has friends even among those who are not Apache." Before Ruth could ask what she meant, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. She gasped, clutching at her swollen belly. Kilenya was instantly at her side. "The baby?" Ruth nodded, gritting her teeth as another pain followed the first. "It's too early," she whispered. "Not by much, but still." Kilenya helped her to the bed. "First babies often come when they choose, not when expected," she said calmly. "I will help you. I have brought herbs that will ease your pain." The labor progressed rapidly. Too rapidly, Ruth thought through waves of pain. Kilenya called for hot water, clean cloths, anything that might help, but the guards were slow to respond. By midnight, Ruth was deep in the throes of labor, her cries muffled against a pillow to avoid drawing too much attention. Kilenya moved with practiced efficiency, her hands sure and gentle as she coached Ruth through each contraction. "The head comes," she said at last. "One more push, daughter." Ruth gathered her remaining strength and pushed, feeling the incredible pressure give way as her child entered the world. A small indignant cry filled the room. "A girl," Kilenya announced, her voice thick with emotion. "A strong, beautiful girl." She placed the infant on Ruth's chest, and through tears of exhaustion and joy, Ruth beheld her daughter's face for the first time. The baby had Chogan's copper skin and a tuft of black hair, but her eyes, when they briefly opened, were Ruth's own clear blue. "Kaliska," Ruth whispered, using the name she and Chogan had chosen if the baby was a girl. It meant coyote chasing deer, a hunter, a survivor. "Kaliska," Kilenya repeated, smiling through her own tears. "My granddaughter." In the days that followed, Ruth recovered her strength slowly. The birth had been difficult, and without proper food and care, her body struggled to heal. But Kaliska thrived, nursing vigorously and growing stronger each day. March arrived, bringing with it the first hints of spring. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of muddy ground around the fort. Ruth knew the tribe would soon be departing for the north if they hadn't already. Time was running out for Chogan's rescue plan, whatever it might be. One evening, as Ruth sat by the window nursing Kaliska, she noticed unusual activity in the fort yard. Soldiers were rushing about, saddling horses, checking weapons. Captain Reed appeared at their door moments later. "There's been another raid," he said, his expression grim. "A homestead just 10 miles south. Colonel Hargrove is leading a patrol to investigate." Ruth exchanged a glance with Kilenya. "All the soldiers are going?" "Most of them," Reed confirmed. "Only a skeleton crew will remain to guard the fort." He hesitated, then added, "I thought you should know." After he left, Kilenya moved to the window, peering out at the preparations. "The timing is convenient," she murmured. "You think it's part of Chogan's plan?" Ruth asked, adjusting Kaliska at her breast. "Perhaps." Kilenya's eyes gleamed with new energy. "Be ready tonight. I feel a change in the wind." By dusk, Colonel Hargrove had departed with 3/4 of the fort's garrison, leaving behind only a dozen men under Captain Reed's command. Ruth packed what few belongings they had: a blanket for Kaliska, the herbs Kilenya had gathered, a small knife Ruth had managed to conceal. "How will Chogan know the fort is vulnerable?" she whispered as darkness fell. "He has eyes watching," Kilenya replied. "Always." They waited, tense and alert, through the early hours of the night. Kaliska slept peacefully, unaware of the danger and hope that hung in the balance. Outside, the fort grew quiet, as most of the remaining soldiers sought their beds, leaving only sentries at their posts. Just past midnight, Ruth heard it. a bird call that didn't belong to any night bird she knew. Kilenia heard it too, her head lifting sharply. "It's time," the older woman said. Moments later, there was a soft knock at their door. Ruth opened it to find Captain Reed standing there, his expression resolute. "Come quickly," he said, "and bring the child." Ruth stared at him in shock. "You're helping us?" Reed glanced nervously down the corridor. "Let's just say I don't believe in punishing innocent women and children for the crimes of others. Now hurry." They followed him through the darkened fort, keeping to shadows, avoiding the few sentries on duty. Reed led them to a small side gate, normally used for supply wagons. "The guard here is a friend," he explained in a whisper. "He'll look the other way for 5 minutes, that's all I can give you." "Why are you doing this?" Ruth asked, clutching Kaliska to her chest. Reed's face softened briefly. "I have a sister about your age. I'd like to think someone would help her if she were in trouble." He straightened. "There's a ravine about 100 yards east. Follow it north for half a mile. Someone will be waiting." "Thank you," Ruth said, meaning it with all her heart. "I was never here," Reed replied. "Now go." They slipped through the gate and into the night, moving as quickly as Ruth's still recovering body would allow. The ravine was where Reed had promised, a dark slash in the earth that provided cover from the fort's sightlines. As they made their way north along its bottom, Ruth heard another bird call, the same as before. She stopped, peering into the darkness. A figure emerged from behind a boulder, tall and familiar even in shadow. "Chogan," Ruth breathed, her heart soaring. He moved toward them swiftly, embracing first his mother and then, more gently, Ruth and the tiny bundle she carried. "You came," Ruth whispered against his chest. "I would cross the world to find you," Chogan replied, his voice thick with emotion. He looked down at the small face peeking from the blankets. "Our daughter." "Kaliska," Ruth said, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Born in captivity, but meant for freedom." Chogan touched the baby's cheek with a gentle finger. "She is beautiful." He looked up, his expression becoming urgent. "But we must go. The diversion won't last long." "Diversion?" Ruth asked as they began to move deeper into the night. "The raid on the homestead," Chogan explained. "It was not real. My men and I arranged it to draw the soldiers away. We harmed no one, only made it appear as if there had been an attack." "And the other raids?" Ruth asked. "The ones where people died." Chogan's face darkened. "Not our doing. We believe it is the work of white bandits disguised as Apache. They seek to inflame hatred against my people." "I knew it," Ruth said. "Colonel Hargrove was too quick to blame your tribe." They had reached a small clearing where horses waited, held by 2 Apache warriors, who nodded respectfully to Kilenia and gazed with undisguised curiosity at Ruth and the baby. "These are our fastest horses," Chogan said. "They will carry us to the tribe before dawn." "The tribe is still here?" Ruth asked, surprised. "I thought they would have started north by now." "They would not leave without you," Kilenia said simply. "Without us." With Chogan's help, Ruth mounted one of the horses, Kaliska secured against her chest in a cradle board Chogan had brought. The others mounted as well, and they set off into the night, leaving Fort Dawson behind. They rode hard for several hours, following trails only Chogan and his men could see in the darkness. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, they reached a hidden valley where the entire tribe had made camp. Word of their arrival spread quickly. People emerged from teepees, gathering around as Chogan helped Ruth down from her horse. There were murmurs of approval and welcome, hands reaching out to touch Ruth's shoulders, to stroke Kaliska's head in blessing. "They honor you," Chogan said softly, "for your sacrifice, for your courage." Ruth felt tears spring to her eyes. "This is truly home now," she whispered. But their reunion was short-lived. By mid-morning, a scout returned with alarming news. Colonel Hargrove had discovered their escape and was leading a large force toward the valley. "How did he find us?" Ruth asked as the tribe hurriedly broke camp. "A tracker," Chogan said grimly. "One of the best. We must move quickly." The tribe gathered their belongings with practiced efficiency, loading travois, dismantling teepees. Ruth helped where she could, Kaliska strapped to her back in the Apache fashion. We cannot outrun them with the children and the elderly, Chogan told the tribal council that had hastily assembled. We need another plan. It was Kelenya who spoke up. The sacred canyon, it is narrow. Only a few warriors could hold it against many. The older men nodded in agreement, though their faces were grave. It would mean leaving warriors behind, one said. A rear guard. I will lead them, Chogan said without hesitation. No, Ruth cried, fear clutching at her heart. There must be another way. But there wasn't, and she knew it. The tribe needed time to escape, to begin their journey north. Someone had to stay behind to delay the soldiers. Chogan took her hands in his. I will find you, he promised. This is not goodbye, it is only until we meet again. Ruth fought back tears. How will you escape once you've held them off? There are paths through the canyon that only my people know, Chogan assured her. Secret ways that the white men will never find. It was the best chance they had. As the tribe moved out, heading north toward the distant border, Chogan and 15 warriors prepared to make their stand at the sacred canyon, a narrow pass between towering cliffs that the soldiers would have to ride through to pursue the tribe. Ruth's parting from Chogan was brief but intense. They held each other tightly, their daughter cradled between them. Remember the turquoise mountain, Chogan said, touching the pendant that still hung around Ruth's neck. Safety, protection. That is my promise to you and our daughter. And I promise to keep the fire lit, Ruth replied, recalling their words from what seemed a lifetime ago. No matter where we are. Then he was gone, riding with his warriors toward the canyon, while Ruth joined the tribe moving north. Kelenya stayed by her side, her presence a comfort in Chogan's absence. He will return to us, the older woman said with quiet certainty. My son is like the wind, he cannot be caught or held. They traveled all day, the pace grueling for a tribe with young children, elderly members, and heavily laden travois. By nightfall, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the canyon, but Ruth's thoughts remained with Chogan. Had the soldiers reached the canyon? Had the battle begun? Was Chogan still alive? As they made camp for the night, a distant sound reached them, the faint echo of gunfire carried on the wind. The battle for the sacred canyon had begun. Ruth couldn't sleep. She sat outside the hastily erected teepee, Kaliska asleep in her arms, listening to the sporadic sounds of fighting that grew fainter as the night wore on. By dawn, there was only silence. They continued north with heavy hearts, not knowing the fate of their warriors. Days passed with no word. The tribe crossed into more rugged territory, climbing higher into mountains that would eventually lead them to the northern territories, and they hoped, to safety. A week after leaving the canyon, as they made camp in a sheltered valley, Ruth spotted a rider approaching from the south. Her heart leaped to her throat as she recognized the way he sat his horse, the set of his shoulders. Chogan, she whispered, then louder, Chogan! The entire camp turned to look as the lone rider approached. It was indeed Chogan, though he rode slowly, one arm bound against his chest with what appeared to be a makeshift bandage. Ruth ran to him as he dismounted, careful of his injury as she embraced him. You're alive, she said, tears streaming down her face. You came back to us. I promised I would, Chogan replied, his voice weary but triumphant. Where is Kaliska? Ruth led him to where their daughter lay in a cradle board, cooing softly at the clouds overhead. Chogan knelt beside her, his face filled with wonder. She has grown already, he marveled. What happened at the canyon? Ruth asked. The others? Chogan's expression sobered. We held them for 2 days, long enough for you to get safely away. Most of our warriors escaped through the secret paths when it was clear the soldiers would eventually break through. He touched his wounded shoulder. I took a bullet, but it is healing well. And Colonel Hargrove? A grim smile touched Chogan's lips. He will not trouble us again, not where we are going. That night, around the council fire, Chogan told the full story of the battle at Sacred Canyon, how they had ambushed the soldiers in the narrow pass, using the high walls for cover, how they had held off a force 5 times their size with clever tactics and knowledge of the terrain. But the true victory came when another officer arrived with new orders from the territorial governor, Chogan revealed. It seems someone had written to newspapers in the East about Colonel Hargrove's treatment of peaceful Apache, about his holding of women and children as hostages. Ruth gasped. Captain Reed? Chogan nodded. He had been documenting Hargrove's actions for months. When we escaped, he sent his evidence east by telegraph. He reached for Ruth's hand. Hargrove has been relieved of command pending an investigation. The new orders are to leave peaceful bands alone if they are leaving the territory. A murmur of relief ran through the gathered tribe members. They would still continue north, still seek a new home far from the encroaching settlements, but they would do so without the immediate threat of pursuit. As spring bloomed into summer, the tribe made its way steadily northward, following ancient paths through mountains and forests. They encountered other tribes along the way, some hostile, others willing to trade and share information about the lands ahead. Kaliska grew stronger each day, her eyes tracking the world around her with the same intensity Ruth had first noticed in Chogan's gaze. She was a quiet baby, seldom crying, content to observe from her cradleboard as the tribe journeyed toward a new beginning. By late summer, they had crossed into a land of vast prairies and rolling hills. Game was plentiful, water clean and abundant. The tribal elders began to speak of making a permanent camp, of perhaps ending their journey here rather than continuing all the way to the Canadian border. What do you think? Ruth asked Chogan one evening as they sat outside their teepee, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Kaliska slept peacefully nearby, growing too big now for her cradleboard, her chubby legs kicking occasionally in her dreams. I think we have found a good place, Chogan replied, his arm around Ruth's shoulders. Far enough from those who would harm us, close enough to other friendly tribes for trading and protection. A place to call home, Ruth said softly. Home is not a place, Chogan reminded her, echoing words she had once spoken to him. It is wherever the fire is kept lit. He kissed her gently. And you, Ruth called her, have kept our fire burning through the darkest times. Ruth leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She thought of the long journey that had brought them here, from a stormy night at her adobe house to this peaceful prairie evening. I never thought I'd find this, she admitted. Someone who sees me as I am, a place where I belong. You have always belonged, Chogan said. You just needed to find us. In the distance, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Ruth thought about the letters she used to write, addressed to no one, full of loneliness and longing. Now her story was being written day by day, shared with the man beside her, with their daughter, with the tribe that had become her family. What will we tell Kaliska when she's older? Ruth asked. About how we met? About our journey? Chogan smiled, looking down at their sleeping daughter. We will tell her that love can be found in the most unexpected places, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to face it, that home is not where you are born, but where you choose to belong. Ruth nodded, tears of happiness pricking at her eyes, and we'll tell her about the night a stranger appeared at my door in the middle of a storm. Han said, please, Chogan added with a soft laugh, and changed everything, Ruth finished. As night fell fully over the prairie, they sat together in contented silence, watching over their daughter, planning for a future that once would have seemed impossible. A future built on trust, on understanding, on the kind of love that could withstand any storm. In the morning, the tribe would begin building more permanent lodges for the coming winter. They would hunt and gather, prepare and preserve. They would make this new place their own, carrying forward traditions while creating new ones. And Ruth would be part of it all, no longer an outsider, no longer alone. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, her family. She had found a love that didn't seek to change her, but celebrated her strength, her determination, her true self. As stars wheeled overhead and night creatures sang their ancient songs, Ruth Calder, once of the red hills of New Mexico, now of the northern plains, closed her eyes and gave thanks for the storm that had brought Chogan to her door, for the courage that had led her to stand between him and a noose, and for the love that had given her at last a reason to believe again. The end.